I remember the exact weight of the words before they ever became sound. They sat behind my teeth like something sharp I didn't dare move around. Not because I didn't know what to say, I knew. That was the problem. The sentence was already formed, clean and simple, the way truth always is when it's too late. It waited in my mouth the way a match waits in a damp pocket, ready, useless, and dangerous. I kept swallowing instead. There are moments when silence feels like an action, not an absence, not a blank space between noises, but a deliberate motion you can feel in your body, like turning your head away from a collision you still hear coming. My throat tightened every time the thought rose up, every time it reached for air. I would inhale, and the warning would climb with the breath, and then something in me would push it back down, as if my own lungs had decided they preferred being empty. I told myself it wasn't fear. I told myself it was caution. I told myself it was timing. I watched hands move, busy, practiced, confident. I watched faces hold the same expression they always held, the one that made certainty look like discipline. I listened to voices that never had to hesitate. They spoke as if the world obeyed language, as if saying a thing made it safer, and inside my head, the warning kept quieter each time. It was learning it would never be allowed to exist outside of me. There's a particular kind of dread that comes when you realize you are the only one hearing a crack in the structure. Everyone else is walking across the floor as if it's solid. Everyone else is trusting the weight it has always held. And you, standing there with the sound in your bones, start to wonder if you're wrong, if it's not a crack at all, if it's only your imagination stretching in the dark, trying to make shapes out of harmless noise. Maybe you didn't understand what you saw. Maybe you misread it. Maybe you were tired. That's how the mind protects you from responsibility. It offers explanations that let you keep your place. It gives you reasons that sound like wisdom, and the longer you accept them, the more they start to feel like your own thoughts instead of something you're borrowing to stay safe. I remember looking at my hands and realizing they were steady. That made it worse. If I had been shaking, I could have blamed nerves. If my heart had been racing, I could have blamed panic. But my body was calm, too calm, like it had already decided what kind of person I was going to be. I tried rehearsing the warning silently, shaping it without sound. I imagined the moment I would lean forward, just slightly, and let the sentence leave me. I imagined the room turning toward me. I imagined the pause after, the brief, terrible quiet that comes when you interrupt certainty. And then my mind raced ahead, faster than courage ever. I imagined the eyes that would narrow, not in understanding, but in irritation. I imagined the tightness around a mouth that had no patience for doubt. I imagined the way a single question could make you look like weakness, like hesitation, like disloyalty. I imagined how quickly a person can be reduced to an inconvenience when everyone is in a hurry to feel sure. The warning wasn't just words. It was a request. It was asking other people to stop walking and look down. It was asking them to consider that the ground might not hold. And asking anything, felt like stepping out of line. And I knew what happens to things that step out of line. The strangest part is that I still believed, right up until the last second, that I would speak, that I would find some sudden bravery, some clean moment where the right thing became easy. I believed in that version of myself the way people believe in weather changing. Not because they have evidence, but because they don't want to accept the sky as it is. I kept waiting for the moment to arrive. But moments don't arrive like gifts. They pass, quietly, indifferent. And when it finally came, when the air shifted and the choice became real, I did what I had been practicing all along. I said nothing. I let the sentence die where it was born. The place where I learned to stay quiet was built on routine. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that smooths sharp edges off days until everything feels dull enough to endure. Mornings arrived the same way, with the same sounds moving through the same corridor, boots finding their marks without looking, doors opening in the same order, voices already shaped before they were spoken. Nothing about it invited reflection. Reflection was slow. The machine we lived inside of had no use for slow. I was not important there. That was made clear early, not through cruelty, but through structure. Importance had its own air, its own distance. It sat higher, moved differently, spoke in statements instead of questions. It occupied rooms where decisions formed, while the rest of us learned to orbit those rooms without crossing their threshold. I learned where to stand. I learned when to lower my eyes. I learned which conversations were meant to pass through me, and which were meant to stop before they reached my ears. Authority did not announce itself. It settled into the bones. You felt it when someone else spoke, and your own voice automatically became smaller, lighter, easier to dismiss. You felt it when instructions were delivered in tones that did not expect reply. Not because replies were forbidden, but because they were unnecessary. The system had already decided who needed to think and who needed to understand after thinking was done. Most days were filled with small movements that pretended to be neutral. Papers changing hands, equipment checked and rechecked, numbers written, erased, written again. men practicing calm as if it were a skill that could be sharpened. The rituals were endless, precise, and strangely soothing, as though repetition itself could protect us from what waited beyond the walls. Nobody spoke about fear directly. It existed in posture instead, in the way shoulders stiffened when certain footsteps approached, in the way conversations softened when doors closed nearby, in the way laughter sounded thinner when authority passed through it, like light through dirty glass. I understood early that silence was not only safer than speech, it was cleaner. Speech left residue. Words could be traced back to mouths. Silence had no shape. You could live inside it without leaving fingerprints. There were stories, of course. They moved quietly, traded in corners, never complete, about people who had spoken too soon, about people who had noticed something they weren't meant to notice, about careers that bent sideways after a single sentence, about assignments that changed without explanation, about faces that disappeared from routines the way misplaced objects do, first questioned, then forgotten. No one said this was punishment. No one had to. The hierarchy did not threaten, it demonstrated. And demonstration was enough. Those above me spoke in a language built from certainty, not loud certainty, calm certainty, the kind that assumes agreement the way gravity assumes direction. When they outlined plans, their voices carried no weight of possibility, only inevitability. Listening to them, you began to believe that doubt itself was a kind of disorder, a flaw in the listener rather than the thing being described. I stood close enough to hear fragments of decisions before they became commands, close enough to sense when a conclusion had been reached before it was announced, close enough to feel the temperature change in a room when confidence replaced discussion. But closeness is not the same as belonging. I had no claim to the room where meaning was assigned. I was present, but not included. My role was to absorb, not to shape, to witness the formation of certainty without interfering with, like watching a bridge being built from the river below, seeing how narrow it truly was, while those on the banks argued about how strong it looked from above. I told myself this arrangement was natural, that order required distance, that clarity required silence from people like me. The environment trained us gently, not with commands, but with consequences that arrived quietly and stayed. It taught us which questions slowed things down, which pauses made others uncomfortable, which looks were interpreted as resistance even when no words followed. Soon, you didn't need to be told. Your body knew. Your mouth learned to close before your thoughts finished forming. Your eyes learned to measure rooms the way animals measure weather. You learned that survival did not always mean staying alive. Sometimes it meant staying unremarkable. And in a place where everything depended on appearing steady, appearing certain, appearing aligned, doubt was not dangerous because it was wrong. It was dangerous because it interrupted the rhythm. That rhythm carried us forward, day after day, closer to something none of us were meant to examine too closely, and I stayed within it. Not because I believed in it, but because it was easier to move with than to step aside and feel its full weight pass through me. When I first noticed the difference between what was being said and what was quietly unfolding beneath it, I did not think of it as responsibility. I thought of it as a misunderstanding, something small, something that would correct itself. That is how hierarchy survives its early cracks, by teaching the people who see them to doubt their own eyes before they doubt the structure. And I had already learned, long before the moment came, that my place was not to challenge the shape of things. My place was to fit inside them. The thought didn't arrive all at once. It grew. At first it was only a sense of friction, the kind you feel when something moves the wrong way but not hard enough to stop it. A hesitation that had no language yet. I noticed it in the pauses between instructions, in the way certain details were skipped over as if naming them might slow the forward motion. It was subtle enough to ignore, and I did. But ignoring a thought doesn't make it disappear. It teaches it how to wait. I would replay conversations in my head long after they ended, listening for the places where certainty had been assumed instead of earned. I would return to small moments, gestures, glances, the order in which information had been shared, and feel that same resistance rising again. Something was being carried forward without being examined, and I could feel its weight even if I couldn't yet describe its shape. The more I noticed, the more alone I felt with it. Because noticing changes how you listen. You stop hearing words as declarations and start hearing them as choices. You begin to sense where other paths were available but dismissed. And once you sense that, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Every statement starts to sound like a door closing. I tried to test my doubt privately. I asked myself whether I was overreaching, whether my position had taught me to focus on details that didn't matter in the larger movement of. I told myself that proximity could distort perspective, that being too close to fragments made them look more significant than they were. It was easy to believe that explanation, because it required nothing from me. But the doubt kept returning, each time sharper, each time closer to words. There were moments when the warning nearly escaped me, a breath drawn too deeply, a shift forward in my seat, a glance that lingered half a second too long. Each time I felt the same internal rupture, an instant where two versions of myself existed at once, one that spoke and one that stayed, and in that instant, I saw everything that could follow speech unfold in my imagination faster than reality ever could. I imagined the interruption, the stillness that would come after, the way attention would turn, not curious, but evaluate. I imagined the subtle recalibration of the room, the mental reclassification of me from useful presence to potential problem. I imagined the silence after my words more vividly than the words themselves. I told myself I would phrase it carefully, that I wouldn't challenge, only suggest, that I would ask a question rather than offer a warning. But even questions have weight. Even uncertainty can feel like accusation when certainty has already settled in. I began rehearsing alternatives. What if I waited? What if someone else noticed? What if the concern resolved itself before it needed to be spoken? These were not plans. They were postponements disguised as patience. And beneath them all was the fear I refused to name. The fear of being wrong. Not wrong in private, where mistakes dissolve quietly, but wrong in public, where they become part of your shape, where one misjudgment can follow you longer than any success. In that place, being wrong was not a temporary state. It was a reputation. I knew the system well enough to understand how it responded to hesitation. It didn't punish doubt directly. It absorbed it, reframed it as unreliability, and slowly adjusted around it. Doors still opened, but later. Voices were still heard, but less often. Trust thinned without explanation. I imagined that slow erosion happening to me, and something in my chest tightened at the thought. Not because I loved the position I held, but because I knew how quickly standing could become falling once you lost the invisible support of alignment. And then there was another thought, quieter, more shameful. What if speaking changed nothing? What if I exposed myself to consequence, and the outcome remained the same? That possibility hollowed me out, because if silence led to the same result as speech, then speech would have been a sacrifice without purpose. And I wasn't sure I believed enough in myself to make that kind of offering. I began to rationalize my stillness. I told myself that responsibility belonged elsewhere, that the burden of foresight was assigned by rank, not by proximity, that noticing something did not mean owning it. These thoughts settled in comfortably, like furniture you don't question once it's placed. And yet, every time the discussion returned to the same conclusions, every time the same assumptions were reinforced without scrutiny, the warning pressed harder against my restraint. It no longer felt like a possibility. It felt like an obligation. But obligations are dangerous when they have no protection. I would sit there, listening, nodding at the appropriate moments, feeling my pulse quicken, not from fear of what might happen, but from fear of what I was allowing to happen by remaining still. There were seconds, real, measurable seconds, when the room held space for interruption, when the conversation slowed just enough that a voice could enter without tearing the rhythm apart. I felt those seconds pass through me like missed heartbeats. Each one carried the same question. Is this the moment? And each time my answer came back unchanged. Not yet. Not like this. Not me. Silence did not feel like a choice I made once. It felt like a choice I kept making over and over, in smaller and smaller increments, until it became the only version of myself I could still recognize. By then, speaking no longer felt like courage. It felt like betrayal of the order, of the rhythm, and most dangerously, of the careful distance I had built between myself and consequence. And the warning, fully formed now, waited, trapped, unspoken, growing heavier with every breath. The room did not change when the decision took shape. That is what I remember most clearly. There was no shift in the air, no signal that something irreversible was settling into place. The same voices continued at the same volume. The same movements followed the same patterns. Certainty did not announce itself. It simply closed. I felt it before I understood it. A tightening, low and sharp, just beneath the ribs. The warning surged upward with sudden and complete. No longer a possibility, but a fact that demanded release. The words rose fully formed, pressing against my throat with a clarity that left no room for revision. This was the moment. I knew it in the way the body knows when balance is lost, before the fall actually begins. The order was spoken calmly, not loudly, not with emphasis. Just stated, as if it were the natural conclusion of everything that had come before. No hesitation marked it. No pause invited response. It landed in the room like a final weight placed on a scale that had already tipped. I remember opening my mouth, not to interrupt at first, only to breathe. But the breath carried the warning with it, and for an instant it hovered there, trembling on the edge of sound. I could feel my tongue shape the beginning of it. I could feel the muscles in my jaw strain against habit. Time did something strange then. It stretched, but not enough for rescue. Just enough to feel every part of the decision moving through me. I became acutely aware of my own body, how small it felt in the space, how exposed a single voice would be against the settled weight of agreement. I imagined the sound of my words hitting the... I imagined the immediate recalibration, the way heads would turn, not in alarm, but in annoyance. The way the flow would break, if only for a moment, and how that break would be traced back to me. I imagined the silence after, heavier than the one I already carried, filled with judgment instead of uncertainty. The order continued, unfolding without me. Details followed, confirmations. Movements aligned themselves around the decision with practiced ease. Each acknowledgement felt like another door closing, another opportunity sliding out of reach. My pulse hammered in. The warning throbbed there too, synchronized with it, urgent and alive. It demanded release not as an idea, but as a physical necessity, like pain that must be acknowledged to exist. And still, I held it. I told myself I was too late. I told myself the moment had passed, even as it was still happening in front of me. I told myself that interrupting now would be disruptive rather than helpful. That clarity, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and that doubt introduced at the wrong time was worse than doubt never voiced at all. These thoughts moved fast, overlapping, desperate to justify what my body had already begun to do. My jaw closed. The breath I had drawn left my lungs without sound. The warning retreated, not gone, but contained, compressed into something harder and more painful than words. I remember the exact sensation of it, the pressure behind my sternum, the heat rising into my face, the strange numbness in my hands as if they had momentarily forgotten their purpose. My body had chosen compliance before my mind could object. The decision solidified. There was a brief acknowledgement of finality, subtle and understated, no ceremony, just a shift from discussion to execution. The room moved forward together, unified not by conviction, but by momentum, and I stood there, still, not frozen, aware that the silence had crossed a threshold, aware that whatever happened next would unfold without my warning attached to it, unmarked by my doubt, a clean trajectory, untainted by hesitation. I felt a hollow relief then, not because the decision felt right, but because the burden of choice had lifted. I no longer had to decide whether to speak. The silence had decided for me. That relief lasted only a moment. It curdled quickly into something heavier, something that settled deep and refused to move. Because beneath it, I understood what I had done. I had not been silenced. I had remained silent. And in that difference lived a permanence I could already feel closing around me. Even as the room emptied and the order moved outward, carrying consequences I had chosen not to interrupt. By the time I left that space, the warning no longer pressed against my mouth. It had sunk somewhere deeper, where it could not be withdrawn, where it would have to remain, unspoken, unchanged, mine. The first signs arrived quietly, not as catastrophe, not as shock, but as confirmation. Small fragments of information drifting back, incomplete and carefully shaped, delivered without emphasis. The kind of details that pass through rooms without stopping conversation. The kind that settle only if you are already listening. I was listening. I recognized the pattern before anyone named it. Before the words aligned into meaning, I felt the same internal tightening return, sharper now, stripped of doubt. The warning I had buried began to surface again, not as urgency this time, but as recognition. This was the shape it had been pointing toward. No one reacted at first. Adjustments were made, minor recalibrations. Language softened around the edges of the facts, smoothing them into something manageable. What could not be avoided reframed as temporary. What could not be denied was reduced to numbers, distances, delays, anything that kept it from becoming human. I watched people accept these updates the way they accepted everything else, with discipline, with restraint, with the quiet relief that comes from being told nothing has truly gone wrong yet. But something had. I could see it in the pauses that lasted half a second longer than they used to, in the way eyes lingered on maps, on reports, on nothing at all, in the way voices lowered, not out of secrecy, but out of instinct, as if volume itself might accelerate whatever was already in. Each new piece of information confirmed the same thing from a different angle. The ground had not held, and the sound I had heard early on, the crack no one else acknowledged, was now echoing through everything. I began to feel time differently, not as progression, but as accumulation. Each hour carried the weight of the one before it. Each update stacked itself on top of the last, forming something solid and undeniable. There was no single moment when realization struck, just a gradual, suffocating clarity. I watched the reactions around me carefully. No one spoke of error. No one used language that implied choice. Everything was framed as development, as circumstance, as the unavoidable friction of moving forward. Responsibility remained abstract, floating above the detail, never landing anywhere long enough to be. And still, no one asked the question I had refused to voice. I felt an increasing distance open between myself and the others, not because they knew what I had seen, but because I did. Every acknowledgement, every attempt to normalize the situation, deepened that separation. I could no longer participate in the shared illusion of uncertainty. I knew too much, not about the outcome, but about the I began to recognize my silence everywhere, in the careful phrasing of reports, in the absence of specific language, in the way conclusions were drawn without tracing their beginnings. The warning I had withheld had not disappeared. It had simply been redistributed, spread thinly across the unfolding reality, diluted into consequences instead of words. There were moments when I felt an almost unbearable urge to speak then, after the fact, to name the connection, to say that this had not come from nowhere, that it had been visible, audible, present before it hardened into reality. But now, speaking would not have been a warning. It would have been an accusation, and accusations require courage of a different kind. I told myself it was too late, not as an excuse this time, but as a fact. The space for prevention had closed. All that remained was interpretation, and interpretation belonged to those who had spoken earlier, louder, with authority. I watched the situation worsen in increments small enough to absorb individually, but devastating when viewed together. Each adjustment intended to contain it instead revealed how far it had already gone. Each attempt to regain control confirmed how much had been lost. What unsettled me most was how familiar the environment was. The routines continued, the structure held. People still reported for duty, still followed patterns, still believed in the machinery that had brought us here. The contrast between the gravity of what was unfolding and the calm persistence of daily order created a dissonance I could feel in my chest. It felt wrong to move through normal motions while knowing what they were carrying forward. At night, the warning returned in fragments. Not as a sentence anymore, but as images, as sensations. The remembered shape of the moment I could have spoken, the feel of the breath I released without sound, the exact angle of the room when the decision locked into place. Each confirmation sharpened those memories, refining them, making them harder to escape. I began to understand that consequence does not arrive all at once. It seeps. It settles into places you don't expect, into posture, into sleep, into the way your mind circles the same thoughts without rest. It erodes certainty quietly, replacing it with something heavier and more personal than fear. Responsibility, not assigned, not declared, recognized. I had thought the cost of silence would be immediate, dramatic, obvious. I had imagined a single moment of regret, a clear line between before and after. Instead, it unfolded slowly, relentlessly, as awareness layered itself over me. Every confirmation felt like a message addressed directly to me, not spoken aloud, not acknowledged, but undeniable. I carried it through rooms where no one else seemed to feel its weight. I listened to conversations that danced around the edges of the truth without entering. I watched explanations form that excluded the possibility of earlier intervention, and I knew exactly why that possibility remained untouched. Because someone like me would have had to name it, and I had not. As the situation continued to unravel, I realized something more unsettling than guilt. My silence had not only allowed this to happen, it had allowed it to happen cleanly, without resistance, without record, without the complication of doubt interrupting the narrative of inevitability. The consequences unfolded as if no warning had ever existed, and in the quiet spaces between updates, between movements, between acknowledgments, I understood that what I was witnessing was not just the cost of a flawed decision, it was the cost of a silence that had blended so perfectly into the structure that it could never be separated. Not now, not ever. Time did not soften it. That was the first thing I learned once everything had settled into history. The weight of silence does not erode the way fear does. It does not dull with repetition. It becomes more precise. Memory sharpens it, polishing the edges until there is nowhere left to look without seeing the same moment reflected back. I carried on. That is what it looked like from the outside. The routines resumed their familiar shape. The structure adjusted, absorbed what had happened, and continued forward as if the fracture had been an expected part of the design. People spoke less about the event as time passed, not because it lost significance, but because it gained finality. Finished things invite less discussion. Inside me, nothing finished. The moment I stayed silent replayed itself endlessly, never exactly the same way twice. Sometimes it arrived as sensation, the tightness in my chest, the heat in my face, the way my breath stalled. Other times it came as image, the angle of the room, the position of bodies, the precise instant when the warning withdrew from sound. Memory did not ask permission. It arrived without warning, uninvited, immune to time. I learned how thoroughly silence embeds itself. It did not remain confined to that decision. It spread into my habits, my posture, the way I measured every future moment for danger, not of harm, but of responsibility. I became someone who anticipated the cost of speaking, before the need to speak had even fully formed. The past trained the present. There were nights when I lay awake, not replaying what had happened after, but what had happened before. The seconds that stretched just long enough to act. The breath I took that could have carried words. The version of myself that existed only briefly. The one who almost spoke. That version did not haunt me because he was brave. He haunted me because he was possible. I understood then that guilt is not loud. It does not shout or accuse. It whispers. It waits. It presents itself in ordinary moments, when your hands are idle and the room is quiet, when nothing else demands your attention. It asks a single question, over and over, without variation. Why didn't you? There were no answers that lasted. I tried offering myself explanations, hierarchy, fear, uncertainty, timing, but they collapsed under the weight of repetition. Each justification worked once, maybe twice, then it lost its power, stripped bare by the persistence of memory. What remained was not shame, exactly. It was ownership, not publicly acknowledged, not confessed, simply carried. I learned how much damage can exist without spectacle, how thoroughly consequence can live inside a person without leaving visible marks. The world around me moved on, incorporating the event into reports, records, and distant recollections. But inside, it remained unresolved, untouched by reinterpretation or forgiveness. Silence, I discovered, does not end when the moment passes. It continues, reshaping itself into memory, into regret, into the quiet understanding that there are words which, once withheld, can never be spoken in any form that matters. I did not lose sleep because of what happened. I lost it because of what did not. Because somewhere in the unchangeable past, there exists a version of the world that never came into being. A world where I interrupted certainty, where I accepted the risk of being wrong, where consequence followed speech instead of silence. That world is unreachable, not destroyed, simply unrealized, and I am the only one who knows exactly how close it came to existing. Even now, long after the structure has absorbed the loss and assigned it no singular voice, the moment returns without warning, not to punish me, not to teach me, but to remind me of the permanence of certain choices. I once believed silence was neutral. I know better now. Silence is not the absence of action. It is an action that outlives you. And every time I remember the warning that never left my mouth, I understand something that no amount of time has been able to erode. The consequence did not begin when the decision was carried out. It began the moment I chose to let certainty proceed unchallenged. The moment I decided that staying silent was safer than being heard. The moment I allowed myself to believe that saying nothing would cost less than saying something. I was wrong. And that knowledge, unspoken and unshared, has become the longest war I will ever endure.